In 1932, a government pamphlet told American families to buy processed food, trust grocery chains, and stop relying on old folk remedies. In some counties, families were actually visited by federal agents and told their homemade practices were unsanitary and unsafe. But here is what they never told you. The families who ignored Washington and kept doing things the old way did not just survive the Great Depression, they thrived while their neighbors stood in bread lines. Number 7 on this list was quietly removed from USDA extension guides in 1947. Nobody announced it. It just disappeared. Number 4 was used by over 12 million American families during the Depression and has been completely erased from every mainstream cookbook published after 1955. These 20 hacks were not forgotten by accident. They were buried because someone was going to make a lot of money selling you the replacement. Before we get into it, hit subscribe. What you are about to learn could cut your grocery bill in half, and your grandchildren will thank you for passing it on. Number 20. The lard bucket under the stove. Every farmhouse in America during the Great Depression kept a lidded tin bucket beside or beneath the wood stove. Into that bucket went every scrap of rendered fat from pork, beef, chicken, and duck. Strained through a piece of old flour sackcloth, that fat became the most versatile ingredient in the kitchen. Depression-era families used lard for frying, baking, waterproofing leather boots, lubricating door hinges, treating dry cracked skin in winter, and sealing the tops of canned meat jars. One bucket replaced a dozen modern products. A hog rendered down produced 15 to 20 pounds of lard. That fat fed a family through an entire winter of cooking. After World War II, Procter & Gamble spent $40 million in a single decade convincing American housewives that animal fat caused heart disease. Crisco advertisements ran in every major magazine. Home economics classes in schools switched their curriculum to vegetable shortening almost overnight. We now know that partially hydrogenated vegetable oil was far more dangerous than the lard it replaced. Your great-grandmother's lard bucket was not killing anyone. The marketing campaign that replaced it was. Number 19. Vinegar as a universal medicine cabinet. White vinegar and apple cider vinegar sat in every Depression-era home not just for cooking, but for healing. Families used diluted apple cider vinegar to bring down fevers by applying it to the skin. They gargled with it for sore throats. They poured it into bath water for sunburn and skin rashes. They used it as a hair rinse that left hair cleaner and softer than any shampoo. A gallon of white vinegar cost 12 cents in 1933 and lasted months. Apple cider vinegar at 18 cents a gallon did double duty in the kitchen and the medicine cabinet. Pharmaceutical companies began their lobbying push in the late 1930s, working with the American Medical Association to label home remedies as dangerous folk medicine. By 1950, the message was clear. Only a doctor and a drugstore could keep your family healthy. Today, a bottle of apple cider vinegar wellness tonic sells for $11 at health food stores. The active ingredient is identical to what your great-grandmother paid 18 cents a gallon for. The only difference is the label. Number 18. Salt pork as a 3-month food supply. Before refrigeration reached rural America, every family that raised a hog knew how to turn it into a 3-month food supply with nothing but salt and a wooden barrel. A freshly butchered hog was cut into sections. Each piece was packed in layers of coarse salt inside a barrel, kept in the cellar or a cool shed. Salt draws moisture out of meat and creates an environment where bacteria cannot survive. A properly packed salt pork barrel kept meat safe and edible from November through February without a single degree of refrigeration. Families sliced off what they needed each day, soaked it briefly in water to draw out some of the salt, and cooked it with beans, greens, or cornbread. A 200-pound hog cost around $4 to raise through an entire summer on kitchen scraps and foraged grain. That $4 investment fed a family of 5 through winter. The refrigeration industry arrived in rural America in the 1940s, and appliance salesmen specifically targeted this knowledge. Salespeople were trained to tell farm wives that salt pork was primitive, unsafe, and a sign of poverty. The skill vanished within a single generation. Number 17. Sassafras root tea as a spring tonic. Every March across the American South and Midwest, families dug sassafras roots from fence rows and creek banks, scrubbed them clean, and simmered them in water until the pot turned a deep reddish brown. That tea was the family's spring tonic. Drunk for 2 weeks every spring, it was believed to thin the blood after winter, clear the skin, boost energy, and prevent illness. Sassafras root contains compounds that genuinely support liver function and have documented anti-inflammatory properties. Depression-era families did not know the chemistry. They knew that every family that drank sassafras tea in spring got sick less often in summer. The roots were free, growing wild on almost every piece of ground in the eastern half of the country. In 1960, the FDA banned sassafras oil as a food additive, citing a study in which rats developed tumors after being fed doses equivalent to a human drinking 100 cups of tea per day for years. The spring tea tradition, practiced safely for generations, was swept away along with the laboratory extreme. Today, wild harvested sassafras root sells for $14 a bag at herbal shops. Your great-grandmother dug it herself every March at no cost. Number 16. The root cellar as a year-round refrigerator. Before electric refrigeration, the root cellar was the most important structure on a farm after the house itself. A properly built root cellar, dug 4 to 6 feet into a north-facing hillside, maintained temperatures between 32 and 40 degrees year-round, using nothing but the earth itself as insulation. Families stored potatoes, carrots, turnips, beets, cabbage, apples, and canned jars in root cellars that functioned as perfectly as any modern refrigerator for keeping produce fresh. A bushel of apples stored in a root cellar in October was still crisp and edible in March. The same apples left in a warm kitchen rotted within 2 weeks. Building a root cellar required a shovel, some timber, and 2 or 3 days of labor. Operating cost was zero. The electric refrigerator arrived with a monthly utility bill attached. Appliance companies and utility companies worked together to promote electric refrigeration as modern and scientific. Extension agents were paid to visit farms and demonstrate the new technology. The root cellar was never officially banned. It was simply made to feel embarrassing. Today, a single weekend of digging could give any homeowner the same food storage capability that kept Depression-era families fed through every winter. Almost nobody builds them anymore. Number 15. Rendered chicken feet as bone broth base. During the Depression, the parts of the chicken that modern Americans throw directly in the trash were the most valuable parts of the bird. Chicken feet, necks, backs, and heads went into the stock pot before anything else. Chicken feet in particular contain an extraordinary concentration of collagen, gelatin, and minerals. Simmered for 6 to 8 hours, a pot of chicken feet produced a broth so rich it set solid like jello when cooled. That gelatin-thick broth was the base for every soup, gravy, and cooking liquid in a Depression-era kitchen. A chicken back and 2 feet cost 3 cents at the butcher in 1933. Sometimes the butcher gave them away rather than deal with disposal. Your great-grandmother turned 3 cents worth of scraps into enough broth to feed her family for 4 days. Today, a small carton of collagen bone broth at the grocery store costs $9 and contains a fraction of the gelatin your great-grandmother extracted from parts the butcher was throwing away. Wellness brands have built a billion-dollar industry on the exact knowledge your great-grandmother used to stretch 3 pennies into a week of meals. Number 14. Homemade yeast from potato water. Commercial yeast did not exist in every small town during the Depression, and at 10 cents a packet, it was a luxury many families could not justify. So they made their own. The water left over from boiling potatoes was saved and mixed with a spoonful of sugar and a little flour. Left in a warm spot for 2 days, wild yeast, present naturally in the air, colonized the mixture and turned it into a living starter that would leaven bread indefinitely. A single batch of potato yeast starter fed and maintained correctly lasted for years. Some families kept starters alive for decades, passing them from mother to daughter like an heirloom. The bread it produced had a slightly tangy, complex flavor that commercial yeast has never matched. Fleischmann's Yeast Company understood exactly what homemade starters threatened. Their marketing in the 1930s and 1940s specifically targeted the reliability and safety of home starters, suggesting they produced inconsistent or dangerous results. By the 1950s, home starters had nearly disappeared from American kitchens. Today, artisan bakeries charge $4 a loaf for sourdough made with exactly this method and call it craft baking. Your great-grandmother called it Thursday bread. Number 13. Wool grease as a skin healer. Families who kept sheep during the Depression never paid for skin cream, lip balm, or hand lotion. When raw wool was shorn and washed, the waxy yellow grease that came off it, called lanolin, was skimmed from the wash water and saved. That lanolin was the most effective skin healer and moisturizer available then or now. Lanolin penetrates skin more deeply than any petroleum-based lotion because its molecular structure is nearly identical to human skin oils. Depression-era farm women used it for cracked hands in winter, chapped lips, diaper rash on infants, minor burns, and dry skin in every season. It required no processing beyond skimming and straining. Today, pharmaceutical-grade lanolin is the active ingredient in products like Lancino and Bag Balm, which sell for $12 to $18 per small tube. The chemical companies did not invent lanolin. They figured out how to charge you for something sheep farmers had been skimming off wash water for free for 200 years. Number 12. The Haybox Cooker. Fuel cost money during the Depression. Wood had to be cut or bought. Coal was rationed. Kerosene was expensive. Depression-era families learned to cook with almost no fuel using a device called a Haybox Cooker, sometimes called a fireless cooker. The principle was simple. You brought a pot of beans or soup or porridge to a full boil on the stove for 15 minutes. Then you placed the pot inside a wooden box or heavy trunk lined with hay, old blankets, or crumpled newspaper, packed tightly around every surface. The insulation trapped the heat already in the pot and continued cooking the food for the next 4 to 8 hours with zero additional fuel. Dried beans that needed 3 hours of simmering on a stove were perfectly cooked after 2 hours in the haybox. A pot of oatmeal packed in at night was hot and ready by morning. The USDA actually promoted haybox cooking in pamphlets during World War I. By the 1930s, the information had quietly disappeared from official publications. Gas and electric stove manufacturers had no interest in a cooking method that used their product for 15 minutes instead of 3 hours. Number 11. Cornmeal mush as a week of breakfasts for 12 cents. Your great-grandmother did not buy breakfast cereal. In 1933, a box of cornflakes cost 22 cents and fed a family of 5 for 3 days. A 5-pound sack of cornmeal cost 12 cents and fed that same family for a full week of breakfasts. She stirred cornmeal into salted boiling water until it thickened into a smooth porridge. Served hot with a spoonful of sorghum or a scraping of lard, it was breakfast. What was left in the pot she poured into a greased pan and let it set overnight. By morning, it had solidified into a firm loaf. She sliced it cold, fried the slices in the lard bucket fat until they were crisp and golden on both sides, and served them with whatever preserves were in the cellar. 2 meals from one pot. The cornmeal cost less than 3 cents per meal for 5 people. Kellogg's and Post spent the 1930s and 1940s marketing breakfast cereal as scientific nutrition designed by experts. Home economists hired by cereal companies visited schools and community groups. By 1955, cold cereal had become the default American breakfast. A practice that cost 12 cents a week was replaced by one that cost $1.50. The switch had nothing to do with nutrition. It had everything to do with profit. First pattern break. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable. In the winter of 1932, over 200 communities across the United States were operating completely outside the formal economy. No cash changed hands. No banks were involved. Neighbors in mining towns in Pennsylvania traded coal they dug themselves for bread baked by the baker down the street. Dairy farmers outside Chicago delivered milk to families who paid in labor, fixing fences, splitting wood, and repairing roofs. In dozens of rural counties, local currencies were printed on paper or stamped on metal discs. These scrip systems kept entire communities fed and functioning when federal dollars had completely dried up. Historians estimate that at the peak of the Depression, over 1 million Americans were participating in organized barter and scrip networks completely invisible to Washington. The Roosevelt administration took notice. Treasury officials sent letters to county governments warning that local scrip systems were interfering with federal monetary policy. Several larger barter networks were investigated. The message delivered quietly through federal agents and local officials was unambiguous. Stop building economies we cannot tax and cannot control. Most of those networks dissolved by 1935 as federal relief programs arrived. But for 3 years, ordinary Americans proved something that every government since has preferred you not think too hard about. Communities can feed themselves, house themselves, and care for each other without banks, without dollars, and without permission. Your great-grandparents knew this. They lived it. The history books mention the breadlines. They are much quieter about the communities that never needed them. Number 10. Pine tar soap for skin and scalp. Deep in the woods of Appalachia and the Ozarks during the Depression, families who could not afford store soap made pine tar soap from two ingredients they had for free: raw pine tar collected by scoring the bark of living pine trees and rendering it into a thick dark resin, combined with lye soap made from wood ash and saved cooking fat. The result was a dark brown bar with a sharp smoky smell that healed everything it touched. Pine tar has documented antibacterial and antifungal properties. Depression-era families used it for scalp conditions, skin infections, insect bites, minor wounds, and as a general-purpose cleaner. A single pine tree could be tapped repeatedly for years without killing it. The soap cost nothing beyond labor. Today, pine tar soap sells for $8 to $14 a bar at natural grocery stores and is marketed as a premium dermatological product. The Appalachian families who made it during the Depression were not doing anything exotic. They were doing chemistry that worked, with materials that grew in their backyard. Number 9. The spring house as a natural dairy cooler. Before electric refrigeration reached rural America, every farm with a cold water spring built a spring house directly over it. A spring house was a small stone or wooden structure built so that cold spring water flowed through a shallow channel across the floor. Crocks of milk, butter, cream, and soft cheese sat in that cold flowing water and stayed fresh for days without a single degree of mechanical refrigeration. Spring water in most of the eastern United States maintains a near constant temperature of 50 to 55 degrees year-round, regardless of outside temperature. A properly built spring house kept dairy products colder than many modern refrigerators maintain their interiors. Building one required stone, mortar, and a few days of work. Operating cost was zero for the entire life of the structure. The electric utility companies that expanded rural electrification in the late 1930s and 1940s specifically targeted spring houses in their promotional materials, calling them unsanitary and unreliable. Farmers were shown glossy photographs of white enamel refrigerators and told that modern families did not keep food in creek water. The spring house disappeared from American farms within a single generation. The knowledge of how to build one vanished with it. Number 8. Dried bean bread as emergency nutrition. When wheat flour ran short during the worst years of the Depression, families in the South and Appalachia stretched their flour supply by grinding dried beans into a coarse flour and mixing it with whatever wheat flour remained. Pinto beans, navy beans, and black-eyed peas, dried hard and ground fine on a hand mill, produced a dense, nutritious flour that added protein and bulk to every loaf. A cup of bean flour mixed with 2 cups of wheat flour produced a heavier, darker bread with a slightly earthy flavor that kept longer than pure wheat bread and provided far more protein per slice. Children growing up in the Depression eating bean bread were getting more complete nutrition than children in wealthier households eating refined white bread. Wheat flour cost 6 cents a pound in 1933. Dried beans cost 4 cents a pound and were more nutritious by every measure. The industrial baking industry had no interest in teaching Americans to grind their own beans. Wonder Bread and its competitors needed Americans to buy refined white flour products, not make high-protein bread from whatever legumes were in the cellar. Number 7. Mullein leaf as a cough remedy. Every hedgerow and abandoned field in rural America grows mullein, a tall plant with thick fuzzy leaves that Depression-era families harvested, dried, and brewed into a tea for coughs, bronchitis, and chest congestion. The large dried leaves were also sometimes rolled loosely and smoked by people with asthma, a practice that sounds alarming to modern ears but was used for centuries across Europe and America. Mullein contains compounds that modern research has confirmed reduce inflammation in mucous membranes and act as a natural expectorant. Depression-era families who could not afford a doctor visit used mullein tea for weeks at a time during winter illness seasons and reported consistent relief. The plant grows wild, costs nothing, and requires no processing beyond drying. The pharmaceutical industry that developed patent cough medicines in the 1940s and 1950s had obvious reasons to discourage free roadside medicine. By 1960, the knowledge of Mullein's uses had been largely confined to Appalachian herb growers and a handful of folk medicine practitioners. Today, dried mullein sells for $12 an ounce at herbal wellness shops. It grows free on roadsides in 47 of 50 states. Number 6. Newspaper and cardboard as insole material. During the hardest winters of the Depression, children went to school in shoes with holes in the soles. Families who could not afford cobblers or new shoes cut insoles from doubled layers of cardboard cereal boxes or folded newspaper to the exact shape of the shoe interior. Changed daily or every 2 days as the material compressed and absorbed moisture. These insoles kept feet off frozen ground, added a layer of insulation, and extended the wearable life of shoes by months. A pair of leather-soled shoes in 1932 cost between $1 and $2, representing several days of wages for a working man. A cardboard insole cost nothing. Some families added a layer of bacon grease rubbed into the outside leather to waterproof it, combining two Depression-era skills into a single solution. The shoe repair and footwear industries have never had any interest in teaching this. Today we throw away shoes with minor sole damage and spend $80 to $200 replacing them. Your great-grandmother replaced the sole function for free with yesterday's newspaper and kept her children in school through February. Second pattern break. In 1934, a researcher at a land-grant university in Ohio published a study showing that families practicing traditional food preservation techniques, home canning, salt curing, root cellaring, and fermentation, were experiencing significantly lower rates of winter malnutrition than families dependent on commercial food distribution. The study recommended that extension agents actively teach these skills in rural communities. The report was filed. No program was created. No curriculum was developed. The researcher later noted in his personal correspondence that 2 major food processing companies had made substantial donations to the university that year. We cannot prove a direct connection. We can note that the skills he documented were already being systematically replaced by products those same companies sold. By 1955, home economics classes in American schools had shifted almost entirely toward teaching students how to use packaged and processed foods correctly. The generation that learned to can 500 jars a season, render lard, make soap from ash, and grow protein in the backyard was the last generation that learned those skills in any formal setting. Their children were taught to open cans. Their grandchildren were taught to microwave. Their great-grandchildren, which is most of us, were taught nothing at all about feeding ourselves outside a grocery store. The knowledge did not die naturally. It was replaced deliberately, one school curriculum at a time, one advertising campaign at a time, one generation at a time. Your great-grandmother did not forget these things. She was told to forget them. There is a difference. Number 5. Fermented cabbage as a winter vitamin supply. Before vitamin C supplements existed in every drugstore, Depression-era families in the Midwest and Northeast fermented cabbage into sauerkraut every fall as a deliberate strategy against winter illness. A 50-pound head of cabbage cost almost nothing from a farm stand in October. Shredded, salted, and packed tightly into a ceramic crock with a weighted lid, it fermented at room temperature over 2 to 3 weeks into sauerkraut dense with vitamin C, beneficial bacteria, and enzymes that aided digestion through a winter of heavy starchy food. A single large crock packed in October fed a family through March. The fermentation required no heat, no equipment beyond a knife and a crock, and no ingredients beyond cabbage and salt. Sailors had known for 2 centuries that fermented cabbage prevented scurvy on long voyages. Depression-era families knew it kept their children from getting sick in February. The processed food industry that expanded after World War II had no product to sell in competition with a ceramic crock and a head of cabbage. Canned sauerkraut arrived on grocery shelves, heat processed in ways that destroyed every beneficial bacteria and most of the vitamin content. Today, a small jar of raw fermented sauerkraut at a health food store costs $7 to $9. A 50-pound bag of cabbage and a pound of salt produces 40 jars of a genuinely superior product for under $3 total. Number 4. The butter churn as a weekly ritual. Every farm family that kept even a single dairy cow during the Depression churned their own butter once a week. Heavy cream skimmed from fresh milk was poured into a wooden or ceramic churn and worked with a dasher for 20 to 40 minutes until the fat globules broke from the liquid and clumped into solid butter. The liquid left behind was true buttermilk, tangy and rich, used for pancakes, biscuits, and cornbread. Nothing was discarded. A pound of store-bought butter cost 28 cents in 1933. A family with one cow produced it for the cost of the cow's feed, which was largely pasture grass and kitchen scraps. The dairy industry understood the threat of home butter production and lobbied successfully in several states for regulations requiring dairy products sold publicly to be commercially processed. They could not ban families from churning their own, but they could make the knowledge feel obsolete. By the 1960s, electric mixers were being marketed as the modern alternative to churning. By the 1980s, almost no American family under 60 had ever seen a butter churn in use. Today, small batch cultured butter sells for $6 to $8 a pound at farmers' markets. Your great-grandmother made an identical product every Thursday morning before breakfast. Number 3. Wood ash lye for cleaning and preservation. This is the one that made the chemical industry the most nervous and worked the hardest to replace. Hardwood ash from any fireplace or wood stove, leached with water in a wooden barrel, produces lye water, a powerful natural alkali that Depression-era families used for a remarkable range of tasks. Lye water cleaned cast iron cookware, stripped old paint from wood surfaces, preserved eggs for months when packed in a lye solution called water glass, made hominy from dried corn by removing the outer hull in a process called nixtamalization that dramatically increases the nutritional availability of corn protein, and served as the base for homemade soap. A barrel of ash and a bucket of water produced all the lye a household needed for months at no cost. The chemical supply companies that emerged after World War II sold bottled lye for specific tasks at prices that added up across a year. More importantly, they marketed the homemade process as dangerous and unpredictable, which discouraged experimentation. Lye is caustic and requires careful handling. Your great-grandmother knew this and handled it carefully every time. The danger was managed through knowledge, not avoidance. Today, the nixtamalization process that Depression-era families performed with wood ash lye is recognized by nutritional scientists as one of the most important food preparation techniques ever developed. The Mesoamerican civilizations that invented it 4,000 years ago knew what modern corn chip manufacturers rediscovered in the 20th century. Your great-grandmother knew it too. Number 2. The community seed swap. Before Monsanto, before hybrid seeds, before plant variety patents existed, every farming community in America operated an informal seed saving and swapping network that functioned as a distributed food security system. Families saved seeds from their best-performing plants every fall, labeled them carefully in paper envelopes or small cloth bags, and traded them at church, at the feed store, and at the general store throughout winter. A family in Ohio might grow a dry bean variety their great-grandparents brought from Germany in 1880. Their neighbor grew a corn variety adapted over generations to that specific county's soil and rainfall. A third family maintained a tomato strain that reliably set fruit in cool summers when commercial varieties failed. These seeds were free, locally adapted, and infinitely renewable. They could not be patented, could not be monopolized, and could not generate profit for any corporation. The agricultural industry spent the second half of the 20th century systematically replacing open-pollinated seed varieties with patented hybrids that produced one generation of high-yielding plants but did not breed true from saved seed. Farmers who saved and replanted hybrid seeds got inconsistent or failed crops. Within 2 generations, the practical knowledge of seed saving had largely disappeared from American farming communities. Today, heirloom seed packets sell for $4 to $6 each at garden centers. Your great-grandmother's neighbor gave them away at the feed store every February. Number 1. Knowing your neighbors. The single most powerful survival skill of the Great Depression was not a recipe, a technique, or a piece of equipment. It was a relationship. Depression era. Americans knew their neighbors with a depth and specificity that most modern Americans reserve for close family. They knew who had a milk cow and who needed milk. They knew who had medical knowledge and who had a sick child. They knew who had extra potatoes in the root cellar and who had extra labor to offer in trade. They knew whose roof needed fixing before winter and who could swing a hammer. That knowledge was the original social safety net, built not by government programs, but by decades of shared geography, shared hardship, and shared meals. When the Depression hit, those networks activated within days. Neighbors did not wait for relief agencies. They showed up at each other's doors with food, fuel, and labor before anyone in Washington had finished reading the unemployment reports. This kind of community self-reliance was not naive or sentimental. It was efficient. It was faster than any federal program ever designed. And it operated at zero administrative cost. The suburban expansion of the 1950s was not designed with community in mind. It was designed around the automobile, the private lawn, and the individual consumer household. The result was neighborhoods where people lived 20 feet apart for 30 years without learning each other's names. That isolation did not happen by accident. An isolated consumer is a dependent consumer. A dependent consumer buys everything they need instead of trading for half of it. Your great-grandparents were not just better at surviving hard times. They were structurally harder to exploit because they needed each other more than they needed any store. Here is your challenge. Pick one thing from this list and do it this week. Render fat from the next package of bacon you cook and put it in a jar by the stove. Buy a head of cabbage and a box of salt and make your first crock of sauerkraut. Save the water from your next pot of boiled potatoes and start a bread starter. Go introduce yourself to the neighbor whose name you do not know. Then come back and tell me our great-grandparents were just being old-fashioned. Tell me they did not understand things that entire industries were built on making us forget. I have a Lard jar on my stove right now. I made depression cake last week and my kids asked for the recipe. I boiled chicken feet for the first time and the broth set solid in the refrigerator overnight and tasted better than anything in a carton at any price. These were not poverty tricks. They were solutions. Whole industries exist today because your great-grandparents stopped using them. Now you know what they knew. The question is what you do with it.